Great. So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody from whatever you're joining us. Thank you so much for joining this webinar series for the Uni-Collaboration Graduate Students SIG. My name is Hiba Ibrahim. I'm a PhD candidate in Applied Linguistics at York University in Canada, also researching virtual exchange and current president of the SIG. The Graduate Student SIG, if you've really never heard of us, so we are officially part of the international professional organization Uni-Collaboration, which is an international organization interested in promoting for virtual exchange in practice and research in higher education contexts. So Uni-Collaboration is based in Europe. I think we're now moving to Belgium, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of the key researchers you read are, part of this organization. It provides training programs for teachers or instructors, people who are interested in facilitating virtual exchange. There are tons of resources, both professional and academic also, that are available to members, the opportunity to be part of communities like this one. So if you're not a Uni-Collaboration member, I really do urge you to consider doing so. It's really not much for students. It's 25 euros per year, but I'm sure you'll get to get a lot, back if you're interested in pursuing your academic research, in virtual exchange. And Betul, if you don't mind, if you can please copy and paste the link to Uni-Collaboration membership from the website in the chat, I would really appreciate it. So as I said, this SIG is part of this organization. We have been around for the last couple of years. We do hold different types of activities for graduate students who are researching virtual exchange. One of them is this kind of webinar series. We do always aim to have at least 2 webinars per year. So this is our spring webinar, and there's going to be one coming up in the fall webinar. So please make sure you follow us on Twitter or on LinkedIn in order to get announcements of our future events. We also run the kind of social events every couple of months where, students can get together just to socialize, network, share more about their research, and maybe get feedback on your research, get to exchange resources about virtual exchange and just benefit from one another. So that's really briefly what we do. And who we are. As we always, say in live activities like this one, we are always in search for new volunteers and new members. A lot of us are really graduating soon, including myself, and we would love for this work to be sustainable. So if you're interested in, community service, if you're looking for an opportunity to add something to your CV, professional development, involvement in virtual exchange research community, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, we really do need volunteers. There's always, lots of things to do with the SIG. So make sure you reach out to us if you are interested in being part of, our SIG. Without further ado, so I'm really honored today to introduce to you Dr. Ufuk Balaman, who is an associate professor of applied linguistics in the Department of English Language Teaching at Hacettepe University, Turkey. His research deals with language learning, teaching, and teacher education, mainly using multimodal conversation analysis as the research methodology. He is the author of the recent monograph, Conversation Analytic Language Teacher Education in Digital Spaces, published by Palgrave Springer. His most recent work also appeared in journals like System, Call, and TESOL Quarterly. And today he's going to be presenting to us on multimodal conversation analysis and virtual exchange research as an emerging methodology. So to you, Dr. Balaman. Before you get started, I just would like to say that, Dr. Balaman is going to speak to us, and then we're going to engage in discussion and Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat while he's speaking. We're gonna have, some dedicated time for your questions, and I'm happy to facilitate that for you. And also towards the end, you also feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and just ask your questions directly. So thank you again, and to you, Dr. Balaman. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to say good evening, because it's evening time in Turkey, 9 p.m. Precisely. So I'd like to thank you to you, Hiba, and the organization for the invitation to talk about my two favorite topics as a research methodology, multimodal conversation analysis, and as a domain to kind of apply multimodal conversation analysis, virtual exchange. Well, I think I'll give a talk for like 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussions. So let me get started. Well, first of all, the talk will start with multimodal conversation analysis. And just a second. And I'll talk about the analytic approach of multimodal conversation analysis. And I'll try to give a brief history regarding the developments of multimodal conversation analysis and the research steps and types of CA research that are mainly relevant to virtual exchange research. And I'll also talk about, related to that, I'll just share some pieces of research that I use multimodal CA to do virtual exchange research. And that will entail, well, some publications. I'll mention some of my publications dealing with the discourse of virtual exchange encounters, and with reference to the interactional management and longitudinal change, two separate papers I'll introduce, and then I'll try to draw your attention to these papers. And then I'll present another paper dealing with language learning behaviors in virtual exchange encounters, and I'll relate it to language teacher education in and for virtual exchange encounters. So how I have been implementing virtual exchange projects in language teacher education, and how I'm also relating it to language learning. So the talk will be mainly dealing with the language learning and language teacher education aspect of virtual exchange research, and how multimodal conversation analysis can inform that will be one of my concerns. And well, towards the end, I'll just try to summarize all the papers I presented and the research background that comes from multimodal conversation analysis in relation to my recent monograph entitled Conversation Analytic Language Teacher Education in Digital Spaces. And in doing that, I'll also specifically talk about the place and the role of virtual exchange for translocating language teacher education, kind of moving beyond the physical borders of language teacher education institutions. And finally, I'll talk about the role of a recent web application we developed within the scope of an Erasmus Plus project, Digitask web application, and how it can be used to facilitate virtual exchange will be my concern. So with this background and outline in mind, I would like to start talking about multimodal conversation analysis. And when we talk about multimodal conversation analysis, of course, we should start with the beginning. The founders of multimodal conversation analysis, and when it first came out, it was only conversation analysis, and that's coming in the following slides, what kind of changes it went through over the years. Harvey Sachs, Emmanuel Chegloff, and Gail Jefferson are largely known as the founders of conversation analysis. And over the years, starting from the first generation researchers, and it just started becoming more institutional. And when it became institutional, of course, language education and more broadly speaking, applied linguists started using it in their own practices started to use it as like an instrumental tool to examine social interactions. And then it grew out of the field of sociology, but expanded to different fields. So it is a systematic way of analyzing social interaction with a moment by moment, microanalytic and data-driven perspective. So these are kind of the main tenets of conversation analysis, and I'll try to elaborate on how this moment by moment, microanalytic and data-driven perspective is operationalized to analyze social interactions that take place in different institutional settings, including virtual exchange settings. Well, how does the analytic approach of conversation analysis treat social interactions? It mainly happens by documenting fine-grained, in great detail, participant perspectives, and doing that in situ by attending to the 4 or maybe 5 main mechanisms. At first, everything started with a single paper on turn-taking, the one that was cited in the founder's part of slide, Sachs et al. In 1974. So a paper on turn-taking is largely accepted as the founding paper of conversation analysis. And it started expanding, and we saw that the sequence and preference organization have also been systematically incorporated to analyze social interactions, and they were defined as the main constituents of human meaning-making mechanisms that also define how humans socialize with others. So we also have repair, and I'll elaborate on how these different mechanisms are treated in the following slides. And then, in a way, more recently, we saw the involvement of embodiment and multimodality, which changed the name from conversation analysis to multimodal conversation analysis. And this is why we have the title, and this is how we largely refer to the research methodology as multimodal conversation analysis. So, well, we have the fundamental structures of conversation, the mechanisms that define how humans interact with each other, how humans engage in social life. We call them fundamental structures of conversation, but they are also analytic tools of conversation analysis. So how multimodal conversation analysis analyzes social interaction data also happens through the use of these fundamental structures of conversation. And as the history of conversation analysis starts, every conversation starts with a turn. So every conversation starts with a turn. I mean, one of the speakers takes a turn, designs a turn, and tells something. And this turn has turn constructional units. And these are not necessarily grammatical units or not necessarily sentential units, but they are communicatively meaningful units that people use to design their turns. And the common rule that facilitated the emergence of conversation analysis is that it is the discovery of, noticing of, at the end of each turn constructional unit. So at the end of each meaningful, communicatively meaningful unit in social interaction, there is a place for transitions. And by just managing these turn constructional units and these transition relevance places, people manage talking to each other and also manage co-construction of social actions. So there is one turn, but there is always a second turn. A conversation starts with a turn, but we always have another turn by another speaker. So this another turn is actually what conversation analysis use as the evidence for its findings. Because in the next turn, we see how the previous turn is treated. If it's a question, we see an answer. If there is no answer, we cannot call it a question according to CA's analytic mechanisms, because we always look what's happening in the next turn, and we try to understand the relationship between these two turns. But of course, it's never two turns. We always see other turns following these two turns, and by the succession of turns, we see the construction of sequences. So what we see, what we observe in all human conversations, regardless of the institutional setting, is a reciprocal organizational conversation. This is why we always talk about at least two turns produced by two different speakers. Of course, it might be multi-party, there might be more participants. But what we try to understand is how conversations are reciprocally organized and how it is managed by the succession of turns. And when we talk about the succession of turns, we also talk about the pairs that are adjacently ordered and that define the concept of sequence and the organization of sequences. So the pairs can be simple things that we do in our daily mundane conversations, like question answer, summon response, or in classrooms given taking instructions. So we also have the concept of preference organization. When we say something in a turn, we also signal what we expect to hear in the subsequent turn. So a conversation is simply the situated analysis of what we heard, or even while we are hearing it, we started to design what we'll say in the next turn, and we also just try to analyze what is expected from us to tell in response. So our analysis of previous turn and our response to the previous turn also shows how we attend to the preference organization. So this just defines the second fundamental structure, or if you treat sequence and preference organization separately, maybe the third fundamental structure of conversation. So we also have the concept of repair. We have turns. When two turns come together, we have sequences. When we bring together different sequences, simply we have a conversation. But the conversations, well, most commonly are not straightforward. We commonly experience trouble in hearing or simply understanding. Maybe we hear it properly, but we fail to understand what is being told to us. We fail to analyze it, and then we just ask for clarification, for example. When we ask for clarification, what we do refers to another fundamental structure of conversation that is largely known as repair. And repair is quite common. I mean, even when we talk, when we design our turns, well, just like I do right now, we just do have problems in the progressivity, and we self-repair each other just to maintain progressivity. We just preempt some potential troubles, and then we just repair ourselves. But other parties in the conversation can also repair, and when repair is brought to the conversation, we just see a movement of establishment of intersubjectivity, because progressivity is maintained and the conversation moves forward. And as the fourth item, as a fundamental structure of conversation, we have embodiments and multimodality, broadly speaking. Well, specific to this presentation and my research interest related to video-mediated interactions, we might talk about, for example, screen-based actions accessible to the co-participants. And they are accessible to the co-participants, for example, at turn levels, but also at sequential levels. And they play a central role in collaborative meaning making. I mean, I'm just referring to the slides and I'm using my fingers to point to the slides, or I'm just manipulating the screen, just changing the items on the slides, just moving back and forward. And this just means something to make meaning, even in video-mediated interactions, because it is all accessible to us. But in face-to-face conversations, I mean, think about everything that happens on the bodily aspect of the conversations, or all the surrounding artifacts that might be used. For example, you're not seeing it because it's outside the screen coverage, but I'm holding a remote controller to manipulate the screen. And if you just would see it, it would become relevant to understand how we are making meaning, because you would just understand there is a forthcoming action when you hear the pressing sound, and then it would mean something. Therefore, it would be part of the analysis if you're using multimodal conversation analysis. So by using these fundamental structures of conversation, what CA researchers try to do is to come up with an operational understanding by using these fundamental structures as analytic tools, and then in doing so, reaching an understanding of how participants understand each other. So this is why turn by turn, movement by movement, and this microanalytic perspective is very important, because what you say in a second turn shows your understanding and your analysis of the first turn. So reaching this kind of micro level will give you an accumulation of micro level understandings, and then you will see how people reach mutual understanding. So how people make meaning by attending to conversation at micro level, and again, on a moment by moment basis. So CA's analytic power comes from reflecting the participant relevant perspectives. I mean, as analysts, we just record and then we just observe, watch repeatedly. And we work on fine-grained details of transcripts. I mean, this is largely known as the most challenging part of doing multimodal conversation analysis, like dealing with crazy detailed transcripts, because we're trying to understand how people understand each other. And the resources that we mark in a transcript is also the resources accessible to the co-participants. So without these resources, there is no way you can identify how people make sense of each other's conduct. So, well, with this background in mind, we might also talk about how CA evolved over the years. First of all, of course, data collection techniques change over time. And then people started, giving more importance to embodied conduct and multimodal artifacts surrounding a conversation, which made conversation analysis multimodal conversation analysis. Well, related to that, and another aspect that changed CA over the years is the diversification of research contexts. I mean, CA initially started with mundane conversations, but mainly with phone conversations. This is something I usually address to justify how it might be relevant to the purpose of this presentation. Virtual exchange interactions mainly taking place in video-mediated interaction settings. If you think about it, CA actually comes from phone conversations, audio-mediated interactions. So conversation analysis actually emerged as a research methodology to examine mediated interactions, which shows us the direction that it goes. But it took some time until institutional CA gained some momentum, and researchers started paying attention to diverse institutional settings, including language education settings, and more recently, virtual exchange settings. And we also see there is an increasing recognition of CA's feasibility for gaining practical outcomes by doing interventions, like by examining institutional settings, identifying the trajectories of interaction in these settings, and maybe coming up with some professional suggestions to improve interactional practices in these certain settings. And in doing so, also improving the operational capacity based on data-informed interventions. At least this is what I've been doing regarding language teacher education, informed by virtual exchange and drawing on multimodal conversation analysis as a research methodology. Well, to see how CA works as a research methodology, based on this brief background, maybe I just thought it might be useful just to go step by step. how does multimodal conversation analysis works as a research methodology? Well, as I briefly mentioned in the earlier slides, CA has an explicitly, exclusively data-driven perspective because you never manipulate the data. You just try to understand how people make sense of each other's interactional and embodied conduct. And this just requires approaching the data and analyzing interactions as the analysis takes place in real time without just manipulating the data. And it requires focusing on naturally occurring social interactions. And then CA research starts with collecting naturally occurring token interaction data. And well, people use selectively cameras, audio recorders, webcams, screen recordings, sometimes a combination of these resources to just capture data in multimodal and multiple resources. And in the next stage, orthographic transcription. Well, fortunately, there are now automated transcription software that we can use but by keeping the sensitivity of the data in mind. But orthographic transcription is the first stage, and it's actually a very useful stage for multimodal CA researchers because you just watch the data repeatedly and then you transcribe it. And then commonly, as a result of this intense process, you memorize most of the data, and then you already know the directions that your research can go. And in the next stage, we have the concept of unmotivated looking. In line with the data-driven perspective, we have the concept of unmotivated looking. I usually describe it as the trained noticing of phenomena. So you have some training in multimodal conversation analysis. You don't know what the data will tell you, but you just watch it repeatedly to see if there are like potential cases and phenomena. You just take notes of everything that looks interesting and everything that might just give you a research idea. Well, the next stage is you just focus on some of these potential cases and you try to determine it as the main phenomenon of your research project. And in the next stage, there is the detailed transcription. Well, conversation analysts adopt different transcription conventions. Recently, the most popular ones, the norm is to start with Jeffersonian. Gail Jefferson, one of the founders. The norm is to start with Jeffersonian conventions. But when you need further details, we have Lorenza Mondadot's convention for multimodal transcription so that you can focus on further details. And then, based on these detailed transcriptions, you would be ready to look for recurrent, similar, or divergent cases phenomena. You determine some phenomena, and then you have detailed transcripts of some of these phenomena, and related to that, you just look for other cases, and then you just bring these cases into collections. You make collections of context-specific social actions. The cases, phenomena, are brought together, and you just create a collection of cases so that you would identify your research focus. It can be a sequential action, it can be a linguistic object, it can be an interactional resource, it can be something done on a shared screen, it can be done, I don't know, by approaching the camera while talking to someone, or by just leaning back. Anything might mean something, and we understand if it really means something by creating collections and to see if it is happening the same in all the instances that you observe in the data set. And alternatively, sometimes we do not do collection-based studies. It still looks like a collection, but what we do is just we track the change in members' methods or these interactional resources to see if there are like meaningful changes over time. And in doing so, we might just bring evidence, for example, for language learning. A participant, a language learner, let's say, might just find something problematic to achieve. at the beginning of a semester, let's say, but these practices might diversify over time or might just go into a different direction from the beginning of the semester. And then by tracking the change in these kind of methods that participants use, we might just bring evidence to language learning. But at the end of the day, what we do is we just track change, and the interpretation part would come later. So, of course, when we create collections and when we track changes, we usually deal with more than 10 hours of data. And we usually have like more than, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 extracts in a collection. And each extract is at least 1 page. And when you have multimodal conventions, multimodal transcription, it usually goes into another page and maybe a third page, which means you cannot include all the extracts that you identified in your collection of cases. So you need to choose the representative ones to represent your data as it happens in and through participants' interactions, and as you observe it as repetitive, recurrent in your data set. You choose representative extracts, and it just requires making some research decisions. And usually, this research decision is done based on the type of scientific communication that you do. If it's a research paper, you choose 4 or 5 extracts maximum, depending on the length. If it's a dissertation, you have the freedom to go up to, I don't know, 20, 25 maybe, depending on the length again. After you choose representative extract, the next step is to analyze these extracts on a line-by-line basis, on a moment-by-moment basis, to reflect how the conversation unfolds as it unfolded to the participants while they were interacting with each other. So truly reflecting what happened in their interactions is the main goal while doing the analysis. And this becomes the findings of your research. While doing this line-by-line analysis, what you do is you just observe how turn-taking works, how sequence and preference organization works, how repair works, and how embodiment and multimodality works. So by using the fundamental structures of conversations and by drawing on the decades of conversation analytic research, you come up with your analysis in research papers or dissertations. So the final part is the post-analytic discussions. This is where CA tries to communicate with other fields that it is applied to. It's a research methodology, and you publish in a great diversity of journals. And when you do that, you of course need to communicate your findings to a larger audience. And this is where the interpretation might be included in the research paper. Not during the analysis, but while engaging in post-analytic discussion, you can actually make some relations to existing theories or existing research papers coming from different fields of inquiry, but not during the analysis, because during the analysis, you just focus on how people understand each other, and people do not necessarily draw on existing theories and research papers when they interact with each other. So, with this background in mind, what is the use of multimodal conversation analysis in virtual exchange research? And in doing that, I'll also try to talk about different types of CA research and how I use these different types in my own experience of using multimodal conversation analysis and trying to improve virtual exchange research. Well, first of all, collection-based studies. Collection-based studies, just like I mentioned in the earlier slide, are done to describe context-specific social actions that can only be understood in that context, that are accessible to the participants taken in that place, and that can be described in a collection of cases. So, well, this can be done to understand, for example, the institutional context. For example, how video-mediated interactions work in virtual exchange interactions. And as an example to that, I'll talk about a paper that we published in the journal Pragmatics. It can also be done, for example, to identify the relevance for language learning or use. I mean, how it becomes relevant to understand language learning and how it becomes relevant to accomplish virtual exchange tasks. And I'll give an example to this based on a collection-based study that was published in System. And another type is longitudinal conversation analysis. Again, with reference to the earlier slide, there is this tracking changes. And regarding tracking changes, it might be regarding language learning, or if you're not necessarily doing language education research, it might be related to language use overall, which might be, for example, done to come up with some outcomes regarding interculturality or other inherent components that are readily available in virtual exchange studies. And I'll present, well, briefly mention a paper that deals with how one participant routinizes her own use of grammar in video-mediated interactions. And another type is applied conversation analysis. And I have applied multimodal conversation analysis just to reflect the type of research we have here. Well, it is sort of related to identify institutional fingerprints, and in doing that, using multimodal conversation analysis as a change agent. In my case, it is related to language teacher education. And related to that, I'll briefly mention two papers that was recently published. And then, of course, I'll just relate it to my recent book and the Digitask web application. So the first paper deals with discourse of virtual exchange encounters, and specifically dealing with how video-mediated interactions work. And the data is screen recordings of dyadic interactions. So how two participants engaged in virtual exchange talk to each other on the video-mediated modality, and then how a range of practices they draw on to alert their co-participants to incipient suspensions of talk. And these suspensions are task-related. So they just alert each other. For example, to search something on Google. So when you do that, I mean, you talk to someone on video-mediated interaction, but you need to suspend the conversation for a while to do something individual on your screen. Well, your silence might be problematic, which requires alerting the co-participant to this potential problem so that the co-participant would know this suspension is okay. There are no problems regarding the progressivity, but it is not readily available to co-participants. At least our research shows that it happens mainly through a certain construction. Let's see, let me check, let me look at something, let me do some search. So this was the main exploration based on our conversation analytic investigation into the data set. We created a collection of cases that let me structure is used, and we noticed that this is mainly done to alert the co-participants just to mainly buy time to fully concentrate on their individual screen-based activities, and in doing so, ensuring the progression of tasks, virtual exchange tasks, without causing any breakdowns in the communication.
Ufuk, this is just to tell you that we have 10 minutes left for the presentation.
Okay, perfect. And the findings contribute to our understanding of the complex ecologies of technology-mediated interactions in virtual exchange encounters in general. And the second paper is actually an investigation of this same structure over a period of 4 years. Well, I was kind of lucky to collect the data from the same participant for a duration of 4 years. And then we noticed that this let me check structure did not just accidentally emerge. It actually had an interactional history that can be tracked back. And we noticed that it was just diverse resources, but over 4 years, it just became a routine grammatical structure in the form of let me check. So this paper dealt with how the video-mediated interactional history contributes to our understanding of video-mediated interactions, and showed us the role of kind of grammar for interaction in virtual exchange interactions with a longitudinal perspective of 4 years. Regarding language learning relevance, language learning behaviors in virtual exchange encounters. Well, I don't know if you experience the same in your own virtual exchange experience, but there is commonly dictionary lookup moments, online dictionary lookup moments when there is like troubles, and to resolve these troubles. And this paper specifically dealt with the situated use of online dictionaries in video-mediated interactions and to resolve word knowledge related troubles. So doing repair in a sense to maintain the progressivity of conversation. And we noticed that naturally online dictionaries play an important role in the social accomplishment of intercultural tasks, virtual exchange tasks specifically. And we noticed that the participants do not only look for unknown words, they also look up for the synonyms of already known words, or just to validate their existing knowledge of a vocabulary item, mainly to maintain conversations. And we also found out that Wikipedia and image search also works as an additional lookup tools in doing so. Well, slowly walking towards the end of the presentation, and mainly in the last 3-4 years, I've been dealing with the language teacher education aspect of things. So teaching pre-service language teachers how to design virtual exchange tasks and providing them with opportunities to see the implementation of their own task with actual virtual exchange participants. So I'm talking about 2 sets of participants here. One set is pre-service teachers. They're designing tasks, they're receiving feedback from the teacher trainer. In most cases, it's me, and they're just implementing it. And in the implementation part, we have the second set of participants, virtual exchange dyads. We are recording the screens of these virtual exchange dyads who are implementing the tasks developed, designed by pre-service teachers, and we're just giving opportunity to pre-service teachers to examine the screen recordings. So using data as a genuine opportunity to examine their own tasks in video-mediated interactions. So, well, these 2 papers were attempts to understand how these procedures work. And then we came up, of course, with the dynamic nature of these process, because we noticed that it's never the first designs. The tasks change. They become different tasks when the service teachers receive some feedback and when it was implemented by the participants. So the procedural unfolding of these tasks was kind of related to these procedures that was designed in the process. Everything started with design meetings, and then it just continued with some feedback from peers, from the teacher trainer, and then we see some redesigns of the feedback. And the next place, there was video implementations, video-mediated implementation of these tasks. And finally, there was the reflections. In these papers, it was written reflections, but in future papers, there was also video-mediated reflections. So based on these stepwise language teacher education models, I found opportunity to just do the entire process in online settings and use virtual exchange for the design process. So to design virtual exchange tasks, we also came up with a virtual exchange project, participants coming from different countries engaged in this project, and I just define how this might be multiplied in a language teacher education model and how it will become an opportunity to translocate language teacher education and move it beyond the physical borders and the nationally described policies of doing teacher education. So this model has been actually implemented kind of at the same time with the writing up of the monograph within the scope of our Erasmus Plus project, Digitask for IC. Digitask for IC was completed last November, and we managed to create a web application completely open, completely free. Everything in it is Creative Commons license, and it's free to register and use it. So this is a web application to design tasks, and our project included pre-service teachers collaboratively designing virtual exchange tasks using the Digitask web application. And then there were a total of 21 groups. So we had 42 pre-service teachers from Turkey, 13 from Austria, and 13 from Spain. And they just created design groups to design tasks using Digitask. And their designs were just assigned to language learners, so that another set of participants again, so that they would just complete these tasks designed by pre-service teachers. And we had 31 students from Tunisia and 31 students from Turkey in dyads. And well, as a result of this project, we actually came up with quite an extensive data set. It takes a lifetime to analyze the entire data set, but luckily we have researchers working on it. So I would like to invite you to take a look at Gülşah Uyar, Fulya Çolak, Betül Çimenli, and Ece Dilber's in-progress work coming up in different publications and possibly coming up in dissertation in this year and next year. And I would also like to draw your attention to Semi Ekin's work. He's also dealing with virtual exchange for, again, designing tasks and lesson planning conversations.
We have 2 minutes, just to let you know.
This should be it. Thank you very much for listening, and well, yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this comprehensive talk on conversation or multimodal conversation analysis. So if you don't mind, I would like to open this discussion by asking you a follow-up question. And please, folks, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can also type it in the chat. And also Betül will post a post-talk survey. So if you could please take a minute or so to fill it in, to share your feedback for today's work, that would be great. So thank you so much for sharing about all these studies. I was actually wondering if it's possible to maybe dive into some of your data set, from any of these papers, to actually show us how you used multimodal conversation analysis, like into, let's say, analyzing a section of, turn taking or conversations in between students in virtual exchange, for instance, just to kind of, give a brief idea of how you've looked at this data using this methodology, if possible.
Thank you very much. Well, that was actually the initial idea for this presentation, to be honest. But while preparing it, I noticed that I'm spending an entire semester to teach how this would work in practice. So I just thought how I can come up with the easiest way to introduce it. But just to briefly explain, the unmotivated looking is, I think, the keyword here. So you just start observing the data. You just come up with some collection of cases and you select extracts. When you start analyzing the extracts, you always start on a line-by-line basis. So you analyze each line. So you just describe what's happening in that line, but your description should also be related to what happened in the earlier line and what's happening in the next line. So you always have this step-by-step, line-by-line, moment-by-moment perspective in doing the analysis. So if it is, I mean, if your focus is related to, let's say, turn taking, you focus more on turn design features. But even if you focus on other aspects, it doesn't mean that you're disregarding turn design features. All of these fundamental structures play a role in your analysis. But your focus, of course, might diverge, and then you might just be dealing with other perspectives. So this is how you do it. You start from the very bottom of conversation, and you just try to understand how it unfolds on a moment-by-moment basis.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
Well, I have a question, but I wanted to wait for others to ask some. Shall I go ahead?
You can go ahead, Bitu.
Actually, I have two main criticisms with my work, which is the same project, actually, the Digitas project. The first one is about interculturality. So it's naturally in virtual exchange. They quite often they ask me how I deal with this interculturality. Do I look at it? If I say no, they ask me, why then did you collect virtual exchange data? So this was the first, this is the first one. I wonder your ideas. And the second one is about representation of data, actually. So as most of us know today, we use how can I say, a verbal transcription, actually. Although we try to show everything happening non-verbally or on screen, we do them in somehow in a verbal way. So we don't see much pictures, much screenshots in the transcripts. And this is another criticism that I had. So if I, for example, for screen-based activities, I'm interested in screen-based activities as well. So they ask me, why then are you using Mondada, for example? Why not other kind of other ways of showing the data? Or sometimes they suggest it to analyze differently because of this representation. So I wonder your ideas about this representation of multimodal activities as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let me start with the interculturality aspect. Well, there are actually two great MA theses, and the author of one of these theses is in the room, if I can see, right? Zeynep Önder. And there is also Cennet Çalışmış. She also worked on the interculturality aspect. So, well, they dealt with how participants interaction and manage interculturality based on collections of cases. And well, it was there because, I mean, it's, well, the design of virtual exchange promotes interculturality, but nothing is taken for granted. It happens if the participants well, collaboratively construct interculturality. And the well, main domain to understand how this happens is interaction, at least on the video mediated interaction aspect of virtual exchange projects. So I think this is a great domain to examine interculturality, because this is how they do it. So describing how they do it happens through the observable resources that use that they use while just talking to each other. Therefore, I think it's you said criticism. It's good that you criticize your own work and others' work, of course, but I think I wouldn't do that on interculturality. Maybe other things. Well, the second thing, maybe representational data. Well, first of all, I agree with the individual screen-based activities, and that was a challenge for my earlier work, especially my PhD dissertation, and I try to represent it. But there is always this challenge. I mean, I'm not really seeing what you are doing on your screen at the moment. Maybe you are just checking some Instagram posts. You're just texting to Hiba on WhatsApp. You're just, I mean, dealing with something. I don't know what you're doing. What I can see is only the part of our interaction that is accessible to me. So this is how I make sense of our interaction. And CA should only analyze that, because this is how we interact with each other without knowing what's happening in one screen. So in my earlier research, my way of bringing it to analysis was again through the participants themselves, bringing it into their conversations. So what they did on their screens was mentioned, topicalized in their conversations. Therefore, I was eligible to talk about what they were doing in their individual screens. So I agree that it just limits the representation of the data, but we're not necessarily trying to represent the data only. We are trying to represent how people treat each other's conduct in real time. If they are not seeing individual screens, I think that's the end of it for multimodal conversation analysis, at least. I mean, if you just, I don't know, maybe look at the kind of a knowledge co-construction perspective, you might just look at what's happening in individual screens, because it plays a role in knowledge co-construction. But again, if you're using multimodal conversation analysis, even to bring evidence for knowledge co-construction, what you would need to do be to see how it is brought to interaction. And yeah, I think this is my response.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will use this as an answer for the criticism from now on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very important. We have a question in the chat from Flavia. Are the tasks designed through Digitask personalized for groups of students involved in a VE project, or are they general? And what are the Digitask focused on? Is it language learning, intercultural learning, specific subjects, goals?
Well, all of it actually, because we currently have more than 900 tasks. I think this is the largest task database that exists at the moment. And we're hoping it to grow. And so there are language learning tasks, intercultural learning tasks, specific subjects. It is available in 7 different languages. So there are also like language specific tasks that can be implemented. And as for the first part of the question, all the tasks available on Digitask, this is why I mentioned the Creative Commons licensing, they can be adapted, revised, recreated by just clicking on the buttons available on Digitask. So even if the tasks are personalized, and even if a task is, for example, specifically aiming virtual exchange, if you like the task and if you'd like to use it, for example, in face-to-face classrooms, you can easily adapt it, change some of the content, but use the task, use the essence of the task by acknowledging the original designer. You can make the changes you like. And we have a digital training module. It's like a series of mini lessons introducing all the features of Digitask. And it's available at digitask4ic.com our project website. So people, if I mean, it is something of interest to you, you can just visit the website, just watch the videos, and then start using Digitask and start designing your task or enjoy the existing tasks, more than 900. And I think we also have more than 3,000 task materials at the moment, all open access. So there is a huge resource awaiting to be explored by, well, mainly this community, and of course other communities dealing with task-based language learning and teaching in general.
Thank you. And I think Betul just shared the website on the chat if people are interested in looking in more detail at the project. We're going to take 2 more questions and wrap up the webinar, just to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Nayada is asking you regarding the program for transcriptions. What would you recommend between the options of Elan, Plan, and Transana?
Well, I agree with Betul. It's the same. I use Transana. Well, I would actually recommend Clan. It takes time to learn, but once you learn it, it's XML supportive. So I think it's the future. I haven't explored this recent one, .t, yet, but I've heard about it. I'm looking forward to explore it. So Transana is what I'm using. Clan is free. Takes some time to learn, but I would definitely recommend it. And there is a free tutorial on YouTube for Clan, developed by University of Southern Denmark and the conversation analysis group there.
Great. The last question in the chat is from Mengdi. After thanking you for this informative presentation, their question is, so you mentioned about focusing on the turns instead of incomplete ones, but when it comes to VE among the beginning level of language learners, especially in her PhD project, they found tasks may stop suddenly. It's interesting to explore those situations as well. Have you encountered any issues like that, and how did you deal with them if you did?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I stated it is that instead of incomplete ones, it's probably my bad, because even if it's something incomplete, it's still a turn. It might be, for example, designedly incomplete, and there is a concept called designedly incomplete utterance in conversation analysis literature, for example. And the example given here is actually a good example, and it would be a very interesting research project to see how the participants are dealing with incomplete turns. And it would be kind of a paradise for language learning researchers, including the ones using multimodal conversation analysis as the research methodology, because it would be a good starting point to see, for example, if there are changes and how the turns are being completed, or whether they are being completed or left incomplete. What are the resources that the participants use to understand each other after the incomplete turns? So, well, all of these are very legitimate research topics for conversation analysis. And yes, I have encountered a lot of issues like this. And then I try to focus on how this impacts conversation. We actually wrote one paper on designedly incomplete utterances, but it was in Turkish, but there are, I think, 6-7 different papers directly dealing with incomplete turns or utterances and in language learning settings. So there is an existing literature on the topic, and I would recommend that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balaman. I just want to ask, so can you repeat the concept you mentioned is the designate what, and also do you mind provide your email address and can follow up with you? We can, discuss more later on after this webinar. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. I can leave it in chat box, but I think that Lenny are doing a great job in the chat box by doing that. So my email is ubalaman@gmail.com. And what was the other one? The references for it's designedly incomplete utterance.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just leave it in the chat box.
Thank you, because unfortunately we have to wrap up our
Yeah.
webinar for the day. And if you don't mind, Ufuk, if it's okay with you to share your slides from today, just to share them in the follow-up email, I think people also appreciate that. And the slides obviously have Ufuk's contact information. Before wrapping up, as I mentioned in the chat, Ufuk's new book is out. And if you would like to learn more about this methodology and how it could be used in virtual exchange in digital spaces, you can check it out. Conversation, Analytic Language Teacher Education in Digital Spaces. And there's also the link to the publication in the chat as well. As I said, there will be a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the link to the post-talk survey if you haven't got the chance to take it, and also with the slides and whatever resources Ufuk would be sharing with me. So thank you all for your, for being here today and for your questions and comments. We hope you found this talk helpful. As I said, please do consider reaching out if you're interested in learning more about the UniCollaboration Graduate Student SIG. We're always looking for volunteers to make this work sustainable. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future talks, also feel free to email me directly. Thank you all, and thank you so much, Ufuk, for your time. I know it's late there. We really do appreciate it. And we hope to see you in other talks like this in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
All on. Bye.